Al, and welcome to the Arcade Workshop Chronicles. This is episode 7, so I think we're finally getting the bumps out of the road on the format of what we're doing here. So we're going to look at two things in this episode. First of all, very exciting, the Arkanoid project is totally finished. So we're going to take a look at the completed project, obviously, and the process a tiny bit. We've been through some of it before, but we're also going to take a look at the history of Arkanoid and conversion kits in general, which is a pretty interesting subject. First up, though, we're going to continue with our Simpsons restoration project. The cabinet, of course, was heavily damaged, and last episode we rebuilt the front panel, which somebody had kicked in and gotten real angry with, and this time we're going to rebuild the sides and the back, essentially by cutting the game in half. It's kind of crazy. So I know I've read a lot of things on other forums where people have games that are heavily damaged and they're kind of like, I don't know, how am I going to possibly fix this? So it is doable. It's the first time I've ever done anything this dramatic. So if I can do it, you can do it. We'll do it together. So let's take a look at that project's progress right now.
So just a quick recap on the history of this project. I bought this game at an auction in Dallas, or outside of Dallas, Texas, about 3.5 years ago, and it desperately needed restoration, but it was a good deal. These 4-player Konami cabinets have become quite desirable in recent years as nostalgia sets in for these great games. And I did get it working, but the cabinet itself was not in great shape. It was heavily damaged on the sides. The control panel joysticks were not the correct joysticks. There was a bad repo overlay on it, and the front had been smashed in and broken, so it desperately needed to be totally restored, especially the water damage on the bottom and the corners and the front panel piece as well. So the plan was always just to go through this game 100% and redo it correctly. And if you've seen the previous episodes, we've rebuilt the control panel back to its original glory. Check out those brand new Wicco old stock sticks. And we rebuilt the front panel in the last episode. And now we turn our attention to more drastic measures on rebuilding this cabinet. Here from the back of the cabinet, you can see the front is removed, of course, and we are planning to cut off the sides. And as cutting off the sides, since the bottom is totally water damaged, we will also be cutting off the back, essentially cutting off the entire bottom of the cabinet now. This required quite a bit of planning to make the cut as even as possible, so when we reassemble the new bottom, everything will fall into place. And we wanted to try to keep this original bottom piece in the base of the game because it actually isn't water damage compared to the edges. So here we are measuring and getting ready to do the deed, and the pressure was on for sure here. So without any further ado, here we are setting up to do the actual deed itself, to cut, making sure our measurements are correct and our guide is perfectly even Steven. And we also need here to account for the width of the blade when you're cutting for these kind of things. So, hey, math is critical. Remember all those math skills I said you wouldn't use in real life? Well, you use them when restoring arcade games here. So here goes the cut. And yeah, so no turning back at this point, I guess. And with both cuts made, the base comes off, including the back and the bottom, as you see there. It was a nice even cut, and now we're going to put this top part aside as safely as possible to make sure we don't damage it, because now we have 2 sides and a back to build. Now it's just a matter of disassembling the bottom part, which is the 2 sides, the back, and the base. And this had been screwed in. I don't think that was factory and glued, so we used a heat gun and a little bit of a tap from a sledgehammer, and came apart pretty easily. And we'll use these sides pieces, and you can see the base there is actually in pretty good shape, so we're going to retain that, trying to keep the game as original as possible. There we carefully store away the rest of the top of the game, the 80% that's fine. And the sides here, you can see how just heavily damaged they are and swollen on the bottom from years of water. This may not have been submerged. It may have just been years of mopping around the game, but we'll use these as guides to make our new bottom. So using our measurements that we gathered for what we cut off, we cut 2 even pieces of particle board. And the important thing here was to recreate both the correct rabbit slots and the original bottom lip of the game. A lot of times when people kind of recreate these Simpsons cabinets, see this little indent that's in the bottom of the cabinet, they fail to do that. So once we were happy with our little bottom indentations for the cabinet, we turned our attention to the rabbit slots that will hold the pieces together. And we had to, of course, be very careful how we measured these, making sure both pieces were made at the same time to assure that they were both the same and that everything was mathematically correct and even, so everything would fold together or slot together perfectly. And we had to actually go back and make this slot a little deeper. We didn't make it quite deep or wide enough originally. You want it to be taut, of course, but you don't want to have to force anything together. And once we finished the first one, we went ahead and checked our work by putting it together with the original bottom of the game and our new front. And lo and behold, everything did fit together very well. And we were very, very pleased. And we had a celebration cookie and drink. One thing we did figure out very quickly was we made the sides a little too long. This was actually intentional to retain as much of the lip as possible. So that was just a matter of once we had our 2 sides done, we measured again and trimmed them just ever so slightly on our table saw, and then they fit perfectly. Now we turn our attention to the back piece. Here, gosh, just so much water damage, and we just measured out a piece which happened to be scrap originally, and it just happened to be almost exactly the right size. And we plan our cut for the center piece, which is the power supply vent. We just drill it out at first, then we use our router, and voila, using the old base as a guide. And then we created this little lip piece you can see there, and all of our pieces lined up, ready to go, and we assembled them together and they look great. And the only other problem was the base was missing one of the stands for the little foot, so we created one of those and then reassembled, and sure enough, it's looking great. This was a lot of hard work over the course of actually several days, so I guess you could do all this in one day if you really wanted to, but we took our time. And there is the top piece you can see rebuilt, the original bottom on the bottom left, and then our cabinet. And the next time we're going to actually be using the biscuit joiner to reassemble the cabinet, fingers crossed, and that will be the big moment. So we'll see what happens. And there you go. Pretty dramatic rebuilding of this game, and so far it's going really, really well. Here's a question for you. What does an arcade operator do when a game no longer is profitable? What happened when all the kids in the 80s no longer cared about Dragon's Lair or Pac-Man? Owners of arcade games would gut the innards of the game like a fish and insert a new game in its shell in the hope of continued profits. Operators of arcade equipment in the late 20th century viewed games a bit differently than the collectors do now in the 21st century. If a game was no longer making money at a quarter a time, it was no longer a commodity to them. A non-profitable game was often pulled from a location to be converted into a newer title. These conversion kits usually came from a different company than the game's original manufacturer. In a post-1984 arcade world, conversion kits were commonly found inside the cabinets of former arcade game titans. Your favorite pre-1984 game at some point probably was turned into another game thanks to a conversion kit and a bit of paint. A conversion kit was much cheaper for the arcade game operator than buying a brand new complete game. A new arcade game in the early 80s would cost anywhere from like $1,800 to $3,500, but a conversion kit was normally around a quarter of the price of a new game. Conversion kits usually consisted of a new game, CPU, some sort of wiring harness, some new art, a marquee, a control panel overlay, and sometimes even side art, and instructions for the installation of the game. Using the older cabinet and monitor along with other things like the coin door, the control panel materials, etc., this allowed a conversion kit to be much cheaper than buying a whole new full-size game. After 1984, arcade profits were slowing down anyway, so operators who were able to survive to this point and time period did so by being smart about what they already had invested in. The hope for the operator was that old Dragon's Lair kids didn't play anymore in the corner of the warehouse might be profitable again with one of these conversion kits. Most major arcade game companies make conversion kits of some kind, including even major manufacturers like Atari and Nintendo and Midway. Kits from other companies could vary greatly in quality and popularity. Romstar was one of the more predominant of the post-1984 conversion kit manufacturers. Romstar didn't develop any of their own arcade games, relying on companies like Capcom, Taito, and Toplan for development. Romstar had some monster hits with this licensing strategy, including Bubble Bobble from Taito and 1942 from Capcom. Perhaps no other conversion kit was more dominant in the mid to late 1980s in the USA than Arkanoid and its sequels. Arkanoid would be released in the USA around 1986, but it was released by Romstar, but originally it was developed by Taito. The concept of Arkanoid owes a lot to another classic arcade game, Atari's 1976 Breakout. Breakout was famously co-engineered by Apple computer founders Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, but it was actually created by Nolan Bushnell and Steve Bistro. Much like in the game Breakout, you control a paddle on the bottom of the screen, deflecting a ball to break bricks above. Missing a ball loses life, and clearing all the bricks advances the player to the next level. The twist of Arkanoid was the vastly updated visuals and sounds, along with a futuristic science fiction themed setting to the game. Each progressive level is different and creates new challenges, and the final change from Breakout comes in the form of power-ups, much like arcade shoot-'em-ups, when the player hits a special brick, adding a new dimension to the classic gameplay. These classic gameplay elements of Arkanoid might make it one of the very first arcade games that could almost be considered a throwback title. Some version of Breakout had made its way onto just about every home computer or home video game console by the early 1980s. It's a simple concept of a game with gameplay that anyone can understand very quickly. This easy-to-understand concept of play and the great timing of Arkanoid in 1986, when many older classic games were losing their profit potential, is why Arkanoid became such a big hit. You will find Arkanoid conversions in almost an endless variety of converted arcade cabinets, including some very sought-after games by collectors. It's not an over-exaggeration to say Arkanoid might be responsible for more classic arcade game cabinets being converted than any other conversion kit offered in the 1980s. Arkanoid was developed by Taito designers Akira Fujita and Hiroshi Tsuno, who were inspired not only by Atari's Breakout, but also the Disney film Tron. The catalyst for Arkanoid was actually Taito's sales department, who had requested a new Breakout-style arcade game. Taito held an internal contest in the company, which was obviously won by Akira and Hiroshi. They would develop their idea into a single project, which became Arkanoid. Many of the graphical elements were actually hand-drawn and in time turned into sprites. Released in Japan in July of 1986, Arkanoid would go on to become a worldwide hit. It would spawn several official sequels, home releases, and copycat games. The official Nintendo Entertainment System version actually even included a paddle controller. As you can see in the photos above, the cabinet was stripped down to bare wood. I counted about 6 layers of paint on this game, which required several weekends of stripping and sanding. The front section of the game around the coin mechanism was kicked in or broken at some point, leaving a huge hole. The previous owner or operator covered the front of the game with a layer of laminate in order to hide the damage. There was also the normal amount of dings on the side, which I filled with wood putty. The control panel and the coin bucket front were also heavily damaged and dented and rusty. The Miss Pac-Man PCB inside the game was not working correctly when I bought it. Since it's been fixed, I actually converted the board back to play Pac-Man, the original game, and set it aside for now just to have it kind of in my stockpile. All the other electronics in the cabinet were stripped and thrown out. They were just a mess. The original wiring harness and the power supply in the cabinet were a testimony to 30 plus years of hacked fixes by sloppy technicians. In the photo you can see here a whole new power system I made, along with the original 1986 Arkanoid CPU I bought off good old eBay. Once the game was up and running, I just needed to wait for the cold winter days to end in Seattle. At that point, I painted and primed the game and got the rusty elements ready, and lo and behold, the artwork from Zabos Arcade came, and Zabos makes a beautiful, as you can see, art package that was all designed by Joe with the marquee and the bezel and the front art. It's just gorgeous, and it's much more elaborate than the original art that came with these conversion kits. I think Arkanoid is just the perfect addition to any arcade with its classic gameplay, its accessibility to all players, and its timeless graphics. I guess those operators looking to make more money in the mid-80s and convert all those old games, maybe they weren't so bad after all for Arkanoid. Alright, so I wanted to show kind of here the finished game. As you can see, it looks amazing. Some of this not just is the hard work of rebuilding the cabinet and the electronics and whatnot, but this great art package by Zabos Arcade. So I encourage you, if you have needs or parts or pieces, he makes some great reproduction pieces and some specialty pieces for all sorts of stuff. So check out his website. He is one of the better of the people who make arcade game artwork, in my opinion. The quality is pretty top notch. And definitely support small businesses right now with the coronavirus situation going on. But you notice it's not upstairs in the arcade yet because I need to rearrange some things. And there's some games that I've strategically placed in the arcade right now because they need some maintenance. We may go into a little bit more of that in the next episode. But the marquee, the bezel, the design of it is just the original artwork for the conversion kit when it came out in '86 was pretty generic. It wasn't very exciting looking. So this is much, much, much better. And it covers up a lot of the flaws in the cabinet too, that if we had turned it back into a Miss Pac-Man would have still been pretty obvious. And I get some questions a lot of times for originality versus like replacement parts. And my rule of thumb is that if a game gets to the point where it desperately needs to be overhauled and restored, it's just a judgment call. I mean, I have some games upstairs, like our Miss Pac-Man game upstairs is pretty much like a C- Survivor, but it is original, so I've decided not to restore that one. But like a game like what we're working on with the Simpsons right now, where it's so heavily damaged and in desperate need of a total rehab, you really don't have any choice but to redo it. So it's just a judgment call. You know, I always try to side on making it as original as possible with any game. I don't feel too bad about this though, since it was not really a great example to restore. And there are a lot of Miss Pac-Man machines out in the world, and you know, it's not like we converted something that was an iRobot or something much more obscure, then that would be a problem. But anywho, that's just my 10 cents. I feel like we took a piece of junk Miss Pac that was almost headed to the dumpster and turned it into something really, really great. So I'm really happy to have this in my collection. It's a lot of fun to play. It's just a blast, and I'm not very good at it. So I can get some practice on while we have it. So there you go. There's the Arkanoid, brand new game to the collection, so we can start moving on to other projects coming up. So we'll see what happens. It always feels so great to have a project completed and finished. And once we take care of some things up here, we're going to be bringing that Arkanoid into the arcade as well. So the next episode, we're going to look at a couple of exciting things, including a bit kit, which is a multi-platform
JAMA game that I got. We'll take a look at that and some other things too that I have on order. Hopefully we'll have by then. We'll continue with our Simpsons restoration, of course, and we may start traversing into some other more exciting projects. So until then, hope you're safe and I hope happy hunting. Keep your social distancing and don't listen to rumor or speculation. Always listen to science. So I'm going to chill in my overalls and I'll see you later.